There's something hauntingly unforgettable about Fairuza Balk, a presence that doesn't just act on screen but lingers in your mind long after the credits roll. And her journey through Hollywood is not just a story of fame but of resistance, identity, and quiet rebellion in an industry that often tries to reshape those who dare to be different. Because from the very beginning, she was never meant to blend in, born into a world of art and performance, surrounded by creativity yet grounded in a deep sense of individuality. She stepped into acting at a young age not as someone chasing fame, but as someone expressing something deeper, something raw and real. And when she first captured attention with her early roles, people saw talent, but what they didn't fully understand yet was the intensity she carried, the kind of emotional depth that cannot be manufactured. And as her career began to grow, she found herself stepping into roles that others might shy away from, roles that were darker, more complex, more psychologically intense. And instead of avoiding the shadows, she embraced them, turning what could have been limitations into her greatest strength. And then came the role that would define her in the eyes of millions, her unforgettable performance in The Craft, where she didn't just play a character, she became an icon of misunderstood power, a symbol for those who felt like outsiders. And while many actors chase roles that make them universally liked, she chose roles that made people feel something deeper, even if it was discomfort, even if it was fear. Because true art is not always comfortable, and that decision shaped her entire career, setting her apart in a world that often rewards conformity. But here's where her story becomes truly inspiring, because despite her success, despite the recognition, she never allowed herself to be trapped by Hollywood's expectations. She didn't chase fame blindly. She didn't mold herself to fit the industry's standards of what a leading actress should be. Instead, she stepped back when necessary, choosing authenticity over visibility. And in an era where staying relevant often means constant exposure, her willingness to disappear and re-emerge on her own terms speaks volumes about her strength. Because it takes courage to walk away from the spotlight when everyone else is fighting to stay in it. And that courage is what defines her legacy, not just as an actress but as an individual. Someone who understands that success is not just about how much the world sees you, but how true you remain to yourself. And as time went on, she continued to take on roles that resonated with her, not roles that simply guaranteed fame or fortune. And that's a lesson that goes far beyond acting. It's about life itself, about choosing depth over surface, meaning over popularity, purpose over approval. And in a world that constantly pushes you to be more visible, more accepted, more like everyone else, her journey reminds you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stay unapologetically yourself, even if it means being misunderstood, even if it means walking a path that others don't fully understand. Because in the end, it's not about fitting into the story others write for you. It's about creating your own, and that's exactly what she did, quietly, powerfully, and without compromise, turning her career into something that isn't just remembered, but felt something that continues to inspire those who see beyond the surface, those who understand that true strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it stands alone, and sometimes, like her, it chooses to exist in the shadows, not because it has to, but because that's where it shines the brightest. Because the deeper you look into the journey of Fairuza Balk, the more you begin to realize that her story isn't just about acting, it's about survival in a world that constantly tries to redefine you. And after the massive cultural impact of The Craft, where she delivered a performance so intense it blurred the line between character and reality, many expected her to ride that wave straight into mainstream superstardom, to take on safer roles, bigger franchises, more visibility. But she didn't follow that path. And that's where her story takes a turn that most people don't expect. Because instead of becoming more accessible, she became more selective, more mysterious. Almost as if she understood something early on that many artists take decades to realize, that fame can be a cage disguised as opportunity. And once you allow the industry to define your image, it becomes incredibly difficult to break free from it. So she made a choice, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and deliberately, to protect her identity, to choose roles that resonated with her inner world rather than the expectations of the outside world. And that decision led her into projects that were unconventional, sometimes overlooked but always authentic. And while others chased the spotlight, she mastered the art of stepping in and out of it, maintaining a level of control over her career that is incredibly rare, especially in Hollywood, where control is often the first thing artists lose. And what makes her journey even more compelling is the fact that she never seemed desperate for validation. She didn't need constant headlines or social media attention to prove her relevance, because her work spoke for itself, and there's a certain power in that silence, a kind of confidence that doesn't rely on applause. And as the years went on, she continued to build a body of work that may not always have been mainstream, but carried a depth that few could replicate, appearing in films like American History X, where she once again demonstrated her ability to bring raw, emotional complexity to the screen, proving that her talent was never limited to one type of role, one genre, or one moment in time. And yet, despite all of this, she remained somewhat of an enigma, someone who never fully allowed the world to define her, and that mystery only added to her allure. Because in an age where everything is shared, everything is explained, everything is exposed, there's something incredibly powerful about someone who keeps a part of themselves hidden. Not out of fear, but out of intention, and that's exactly what she did. She created a boundary between her art and her personal life, something that many struggle to maintain, and in doing so, she preserved not only her identity, but also the authenticity of her work. Because when an artist becomes too exposed, too consumed by the public eye, it can dilute the very essence of what makes their work impactful. But she avoided that trap. She remained grounded, focused, and deeply connected to her craft. And that's why her performances continue to resonate, because they come from a place of truth, not performance for the sake of attention. And if you look closely, you'll notice that her career isn't defined by quantity, but by intensity, by the kind of roles that leave a mark, that stay with you, that make you think. And that's a different kind of success, one that isn't measured by box office numbers or awards, but by impact, by the way it influences those who watch, those who feel, those who connect. And that's where her true legacy lies, not in how often she appeared, but in how deeply she affected those moments when she did. And as you continue to explore her journey, you start to see a pattern, a deliberate refusal to conform, a quiet resistance against the pressures of an industry that thrives on control. And that resistance is what makes her story so inspiring, because it reminds you that you don't have to follow the expected path to be successful. You don't have to be everywhere to matter sometimes. The most powerful presence is the one that chooses when and where to appear, the one that values meaning over visibility, depth over popularity, and truth over approval. And in a world that constantly pushes you to be more, to do more, to show more, her journey offers a different perspective, one that is quieter, more intentional, and ultimately more powerful. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how loud your story is, it's about how real it is. And hers, without a doubt, is one of the realest you'll ever come across. And as her journey continued to unfold, Fairuza Balk seemed to move even further away from the predictable rhythm of Hollywood, almost like someone who had already seen behind the curtain and decided that the illusion of constant fame wasn't worth the cost of losing herself. Because what many people don't realize is that staying in the spotlight often requires a kind of compromise that slowly chips away at who you really are, and she refused to let that happen, choosing instead a path that was quieter but far more intentional. And this is where her story becomes something deeper than just a career narrative. It becomes a reflection of inner strength, of knowing when to step forward and when to step back, of understanding that not every opportunity is meant to be taken, and that sometimes the most powerful decision is the one that looks like a step backward to everyone else, because while the world was chasing visibility, she was protecting meaning. And that difference is what separates artists from icons, because icons are not defined by how often they appear, but by how unforgettable they are when they do. And that's exactly what she mastered over time, appearing in projects that carried a certain edge, a certain emotional weight, like The Waterboy, where even in a more mainstream and comedic setting, She brought a unique presence that stood out in a way that felt almost effortless, proving once again that she didn't need to dominate the screen to own it, and that subtle power became one of her greatest strengths, the ability to leave an impression without forcing it.